questions. Questions orales. The honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock.
This desperate Prime Minister announced a temporary pause on carbon tax on home heating for some Canadians in some regions, but only if you heat with oil. How is that fair? In Sudbury, temperatures dropped to -30 in the winter. Families are struggling to keep the heat on. Conservatives will take the carbon tax off of all home heating bills on all Canadians. On Monday, the Liberal MP from Sudbury has a choice. Vote for the Prime Minister's carbon tax or vote for our common sense Conservative plan to take the tax off and keep the heat on for everyone in Sudbury.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, when it comes to fighting climate change, all I ever hear from the Conservative Party is what they oppose. They oppose providing heat pumps to save on energy bills. They oppose price on pollution that will put more money in the pockets of Canadians. The heat pump program is a national program. They also oppose the offshore renewable energy projects. If the Conservative Party actually cares about Canadians, they would present policies that actually support and not just cut on government programs. Climate change is important. We're taking address to deal with this, and that's what we're going to be doing, Madam Speaker.
Honourable for South Surrey, White Rock.
The Prime Minister is creating two classes of Canadians, those who pay the carbon tax and those who don't. The temporary pause on home heating is for some Canadians, but not for everyone in North Bay. The North Bay Food Bank reports they're running low on supplies. Winter is coming. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, people are forced to choose between heating and eating. He's not worth the cost. On Monday, the Liberal MP from North Bay has a choice. Vote for the Liberal carbon tax or vote with common sense Conservatives to take the tax off and keep the heat on for everyone in North Bay.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Madam Speaker, we're helping Canadians all over the country to go away from expensive, polluting fuels as quickly as possible to fight climate change. This is why we're making it even cheaper and easier to install heat pumps. We're expanding the program to save $2,500 a year on home heating bills and put more money in people's pockets. This is particularly important for rural and remote communities. The Conservatives are doing all they can to end action on climate change, cut government programs, and block good jobs on renewable projects. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member South Surrey, White Rock.
What happened to a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. The Liberal member for Thunder Bay Superior North has been in cabinet for 8 years, yet energy prices have skyrocketed in her region. The Prime Minister's temporary pause on carbon tax applies to some Canadians in some regions, but not everyone in Thunder Bay. Not fair. Conservatives will take the carbon tax off all home heating bills for all Canadians. On Monday, the Liberal minister from Northern Ontario has a choice. Vote for the Liberal carbon tax or vote with common sense Conservatives to take the tax off and keep the heat on for everyone in Thunder Bay.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Madam Speaker, every day Liberal MPs stand up against the Conservative Party who routinely vote against vital supports for affordability, housing, and health care. We have been there for Canadians across every region for the past 8 years. Meanwhile, the Conservative MPs are opposing every single measure we introduced to address affordability and climate change. This approach is reckless. Instead of their track record of divisive politics, they should be able to support good measures to help Canadians. This is a national program. Despite the misinformation from the Conservative Party, is reckless and unacceptable.
I want to remind members that they'll want to, I'm sure that whoever posed the question wants to hear it as opposed to hearing its members interrupt. L'honorable député de Louis.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, this Prime Minister has found a new way to divide Canadians. Some Canadians will get the pause in the Liberal carbon tax, and then the 97% of other Canadians who won't get it. That shows very clearly that this tax is not worth it, just like the Prime Minister. And in fact, it just shows that the Liberal carbon tax is a tax measure, not an environmental one. When will the Prime Minister finally understand and let all Liberal members vote with common sense and scrap the Liberal carbon tax on residential heating? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. Madam Speaker, there is no price on pollution in Quebec. At the federal level, when it comes to fighting climate change, all we hear from the Conservatives is that they are opposed to heat pumps for saving on energy bills. That's a national program. They oppose pricing pollution and giving money back to Canadians. They don't want any of that. If they really cared about Canadians, they would bring forward a plan and not only say what they want to scrap programs and not support Canadians, and they also don't want to do anything about climate change. The Honourable Member, what we want to scrap, Madam Speaker, is the Liberal carbon tax. Here's something everyone agrees on. In Canada, winter is cold. You need to heat your home, and that's expensive. That's why we need home heating during the winter. Everyone agrees on that, and what we don't agree on is that some people seem to think it would be good to have a carbon tax on heating. We don't agree with that. On Monday, there will be a vote on this. And it even seems like the NDP will vote in favor of our motion. Now, while I respect the NDP, I'll believe it when I see it. Now, another thing, we don't know if the Bloc Québécois will vote with the Liberals or with common sense. When will we know if the Prime Minister is going to allow his members to vote for common sense? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Madam Speaker, every day, Liberal members oppose the Conservative Party, who are constantly standing against common sense measures on housing and health. Over the last 8 years, we have supported Canadians throughout the country, while Conservative members stand against all of the measures we have introduced to fight poverty and climate change. Their approach is irresponsible. Instead of continuing with their divisive policies, they should support good measures to support Canadians throughout the country. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Madam Speaker, yesterday TVA announced that it will be reducing its staff by 550 positions. It's a dark day not only for the business but for Quebec television. The Bloc Québécois stands with the women and men who, after many years of giving their time and talent to the business, have now been laid off. Traditional television has been threatened for years. Everyone knows that, but nothing has been done. What is it going to take for the government to finally pay attention and realize that the future of our television is in danger? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Madam Speaker, first of all, our thoughts are with the more than 500 families affected by these layoffs. We will be there for them and for the media and cultural industries. The reality is that this is why we need to continue with our work on C11. That's why we brought in that bill. Unfortunately, the Conservatives still stand against the measures to protect our cultural industries and Canadian content. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Madam Speaker, Pierre-Carl Pelado was very clear. Traditional TV's business model no longer works. We need to rethink how we do things. That's true for TV, radio, and newspapers. We need to rethink how we do things, and if we don't recognize the scope of the crisis of our media, well, then our culture, our very culture, our creators, our access to information will all be threatened. We are at a crossroads. What's the plan here? What will the government do to save traditional media? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I stand strongly with all of the journalists and other workers at Québécois and TVA, the 500 people who lost their jobs yesterday. This is bad news for Quebec. This is a decision made by a private business. We will always support journalists and support access to information. And this is just why C11 is so important. And we hope that the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives will vote with us to help Canadian and Quebec journalists.
For Nunavut.
The Liberals continue to ignore the NDP's call to reform Nutrition North. Last month, the minister made an announcement that didn't make any reforms and only gave support to a tiny fraction of hunters and food-sharing initiatives. Continuing to subsidize for-profit companies is not reform. When will this government stop equating a few thousands of dollars in supports to hunters compared to the millions in subsidies to for-profit corporations?
The Honourable Minister for Northern Affairs.
Thank you. I thank the member for that very important question. Transparency, accountability, and effectiveness are of Nutrition North are our absolute top priorities. That's why we've established the Nutrition North Compliance Audit Review Committee to look at how the subsidy is rolled out. That's why we've expanded Nutrition North program to include the Harvester Support Grant, which helps traditional hunters hunt and harvest and fish. That's why we've created the Community Foods Program, which works with schools and nonprofits to make sure people are getting the nutritious food they need.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Madam Speaker, food banks like Loaves and Fishes in Nanaimo are overwhelmed. 2 million Canadians are turning to food banks. That's the highest number we've ever seen. Clearly, food prices, are out of control and families are suffering. The Liberals promised food costs would be lower by now, but their out-of-touch plan of nicely asking CEOs to stabilize already high prices isn't working. So will the Liberals support the NDP's plan to bring down grocery costs by putting people before profits?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Madam Speaker, our government has listened to Canadians over months of, saying that they're struggling to pay their bills, and we recognize that that's challenging when you see a grocery industry that's highly consolidated and with 80% market share, and food prices are way too high. That's why we called the largest grocery chains and CEOs to Ottawa who have developed action plans. We're now seeing them implement those action plans, and we are monitoring closely to make sure that we can hold those grocery chains accountable. We're also updating our competition laws to increase competition in the marketplace, and I think that's essential. That's responsible action on behalf of our government.
For Colonial Lake Country.
Madam Speaker, last Thursday the Prime Minister flip-flopped on his NDP Liberal carbon tax scheme. He's giving a tax pause to select people for select types of home heating. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. With winter just around the corner, every Canadian deserves tax relief on their home heating, including in places like Sault Ste. Marie. On Monday's vote, can that member have the freedom to vote for our conservative common sense plan to take the tax off all forms of home heating for those in Sault Ste. Marie and for all Canadians?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Fighting climate change while helping families with their affordability challenges is a dual priority, and a serious plan needs to have both. Our government is standing up to take action on the environment in a way that directly helps Canadians, and the recent changes are about home heating oil, the dirtiest way to heat one's home. And as a rural member of Parliament, a lot of my neighbours use home heating oil, and I want to help them get off of that. And this plan does just that. There are more people that use home heating oil in the province of Ontario than there are in Nova Scotia. This is a pan-Canadian solution to getting off home heating oil, just like we're trying to get off coal. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Lake Country.
Well, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister has created two classes of Canadians, those that pay carbon tax and those that don't. And I'm sure the member for Sault Ste. Marie has been hearing the same thing from his residents as I have from mine. People are struggling to afford to keep the heat on when the temperatures go down. They don't understand why they're being punished for using clean, natural gas. So again, on Monday, will the member for Sault Ste. Marie vote with his Liberal government's costly, unfair tax on home heating, or will he stand with the Conservative motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on for residents of Sault Ste. Marie and for all Canadians?
Great question.
The honourable parliamentary secretary, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think it's important to point out, since the question came from a member from British Columbia, that British Columbia doesn't have a federal carbon tax. They use their own, and they're actually a leading province on fighting climate change. Conservatives keep claiming that pollution pricing is driving up inflation, Madam Speaker, and that is just false. This is about moving away from the dirtiest way to heat a home, the least healthy way to heat a home, and lowering emissions at the same time, Madam Speaker. You know, it would be great that if in this place we discussed not whether we should fight climate change, but how we fight climate change. It would be great to hear from the Conservatives if they have a plan.
Honourable for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, they finally admitted that their carbon tax is making it harder for Canadians to afford to heat their homes. The Liberals have said that only people who elect Liberals will get a break. To folks who can't afford to eat, heat or house themselves, this Prime Minister just isn't worth the cost. 7 of 8 members of Parliament in the City of Ottawa are Liberals, but the common sense for MP for Carleton will give them all a chance to take the tax off so Ottawans can keep the heat on. Will the Liberal member members for Ottawa vote for our common sense plan to take the carbon tax off home heating bills for everyone in Ottawa and Eastern Ontario?
That's right. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. All of the Conservatives, including that member, ran on a platform that included a plan to price carbon. They also ran on a plan with a clean fuel standard, almost identical to what was proposed by our government. Now, that member has many constituents that use home heating oil, and that's bad for our air quality. It raises emissions. It's the dirtiest and the most expensive way to heat one's home, and we are providing free heat pumps for any Canadian whose province wants to work with our government to get them off of home heating oil.
I just want to say it's quite disrespectful when a member is standing up answering a question and others are having conversations across the way. So again, I want to remind members that if they don't want to take part in question period and be respectful, they should maybe step out and have those conversations together somewhere else. The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
What's clear is that this is a tax plan, not an environmental plan. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, the Liberals told Canadians that if they wanted a break from the carbon tax, that they had to vote Liberal. Ottawa has 7 Liberal MPs. Glengarry Prescott Russell has a Liberal MP. Kingston and the Islands has a Liberal MP. But with all of these Liberals, why don't the residents of Eastern Ontario and Ottawa get a break from the carbon tax? Will any of these Liberal MPs, the member for Kingston and the Islands, stand up right now and say that they will vote to scrap the tax on home heating?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Now, my friend and colleague from Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes, Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes, knows that he ran on a platform to price carbon in the last election. He promised his constituents that he cared about climate change. As I said before, it would be great that if in this House we could spend some time debating how we fight climate change, not if we fight climate change, Madam Speaker. Look, this is not only hypocritical of the Conservatives, it shows that they cannot be trusted. Their plans are risky. If they had a plan, it would be risky. It's irresponsible and reckless, Madam Speaker.
Absolutely. L'honorable député de Bellechasse-les-Îles-Chamin-Lévis.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Îles-Chamin-Lévis. Thank you, Madam Speaker. After 8 years, this government is making Quebecers poorer. The second carbon tax does apply to Quebec, up to 20 cents per litre of gas. And that's not my opinion. It's the parliamentary budget officer who said so. And that's not enough for the Bloc Québécois. It wants to radically increase the carbon tax. Voting for the Bloc Québécois is a steep price. We have a Conservative motion asking for the carbon tax to be scrapped for everyone. Will the Liberals support this common sense motion to scrap the carbon tax on all forms of heating for all Canadians? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. Madam Speaker, it's really stretching the truth here and not saying something quite right. Because the member who just spoke was at the National Assembly of Quebec when they priced pollution. Quebec was a real leader, global leader, when it did that. And now here, this member gets up in the House and says that she doesn't believe in the carbon tax. I think she should speak to the leader of the opposition and tell him that this is not a way to support Canadians, Quebecers, or the environment. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Chamin-Lévis. Madam Speaker, after 8 years in power, this government is panicking. The Prime Minister announced a pause on the carbon tax for the Atlantic region. That's not enough. We are asking him to be fair to all Canadians, including Quebecers. Despite what the Bloc Québécois says, the second carbon tax will apply to Quebec. There is a real cost to voting for the Bloc because they want to radically increase the tax. I would like to remind you that, Madam Speaker. Will the Prime Minister ignore the demands of the Bloc Québécois and vote for our motion to help Quebecers? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Madam Speaker, my honourable colleague doesn't seem to have understood my answer. When she was part of the government in the National Assembly of Quebec, she supported a price on carbon. Quebec, both in the past and today, was a leader in the fight against climate change. I don't understand how my colleague can rise today and say that a price on pollution is not one of the best solutions for climate change. I would strongly encourage her and other Conservatives to speak to their leader to ensure that he understands that pricing pollution is important for Quebecers and Canadians throughout the country. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Madam Speaker, we've really seen a bomb dropped on the world of Quebec television. I would just ask members who are not being respectful in the House, when it's not their turn to speak, I would just tell them, once again, if they wish to speak, they should do so outside the House. The Honourable Member for Drummond, from the beginning, please. Madam Speaker, a real bomb was dropped into the world of Quebec television. TVA, the most watched TV business in Quebec, will have to lay off 547 people. That's a third of its staff. We are losing incredible people working in our culture sector. This is a disaster, and it was unfortunately something that should have been foreseen. If this could happen to TVA, it could happen to any of our businesses. We need to rethink everything. We need to work really hard. Does the minister really think that C11 and C18 are enough to save Quebec media? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage. Madam Speaker, this is another sad example of exactly what our bill on online broadcasting aimed to do something about. We know that it's not easy to do something to make the media landscape fairer to all voices within Canada. But we will ensure that all markets, including the Francophone market throughout Canada, are supported. Our culture and democracy depend on the measures that we will take to support a media system that Canadians deserve and expect. That's what we're doing, and that's what the Conservatives have opposed at every stage. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Madam Speaker, these hundreds of jobs lost with TVA will have a direct impact on rural news. Fewer journalists, fewer distributors, fewer studios, less airtime, smaller teams with fewer resources. And if you add that to the fact that there's a crisis in printed media in our rural and local areas, and you have the perfect storm for our rural regions to disappear from the radar. And meanwhile, the Online News Act seems to be hitting a wall. What will the Minister of Heritage do to help support our radio, TV, and newspapers outside major urban centres? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Services. Madam Speaker, once again, our thoughts go out to workers and their families, especially with the holidays coming up. This situation could have been avoided, and all of these workers would still have a job if the Conservatives had not spent the last few years constantly opposing C11. Yes, C11 is enough. Yes, we are there with a bill that would help save jobs in media. Luckily, we have brought in C11, and that will provide solutions to keep well-paying jobs.
Calgary Heritage.
The single mom in Calgary who might lose her home next month woke up to news that one part of the country gets relief from the NDP Liberal carbon tax. She does not. After 8 years, this Prime Minister finally admits he's not worth the cost. When will he realize that heating your home is not a luxury and end this carbon tax chaos for all Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, with respect to the colleague, what we set up is a national program. We have heat pumps that will be available to all provinces. Right now, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland, Labrador have signed up. The minister yesterday was talking with BC and Manitoba. So I encourage our Conservative members to talk to their Conservative premiers to call us and get it involved so that we can make sure that we provide free heat pumps to all Canadians to make sure we get off of oil energy as quickly as possible. It's dirty and it's expensive.
And for Calgary Heritage.
Here in Calgary, temperatures can drop to 40 below Celsius in the winter. A heat pump is not the solution for people in my community who are already struggling. On Monday, the Liberal member from Calgary Skyview has a choice. Will he vote for the Prime Minister's carbon tax? Or, after 8 years of sitting as an NDP Liberal, will he vote for our Conservative plan to axe the tax and keep the heat on?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. There are Canadians in every province and territory that use home heating oil to heat their homes. It's the most expensive way to heat one's home. It's the dirtiest way to heat one's home. It's the most emissions-intensive way to heat a home, and it's also the least healthy way to heat a home, Madam Speaker. Our Canada-wide program will get Canadians off of home heating oil and using a heat pump. This is a program which is for every province and territory in the country. It's all about lowering our emissions. Former Liberal governments phased out coal. We are going to continue to phase out coal. We're going to continue to work towards an emissions-free Canada.
Centre.
Madam Speaker, last week, after 8 years of the Prime Minister pretending that his way was the only way to reduce emissions, he announced a pause on the carbon tax on home heating, but only for some Canadians, only in some regions, not for all Canadians. Calgarians are already struggling to meet everyday expenses and keep warm during cold winter nights. On Monday, the member from Calgary Skyview has a choice to make. Will he continue to support the Prime Minister's plan to divide Canadians by taxing regions differently, or will he be allowed to support our common-sense Conservative plan to take the tax off and keep the heat on for all Canadians?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Now, I'll accept that the member from Calgary Centre probably has 0 constituents that use home heating oil. That's not true across the whole province. There are Albertans that use home heating oil that aren't on propane or natural gas. The difference between propane and natural gas and home heating oil is that home heating oil is way more expensive, way more emissions intensive, it's less healthy, and we need to get Canadians off of that product and to using a heat pump, Madam Speaker. Now, we already know that the Conservative Party of Canada is here for the oil and gas sector. Let's see if they're here to fight climate change and help Canadians get onto a heat pump.
The Honourable for Calgary Centre.
Madam Speaker, that's the first time I've heard somebody differentiate the warmth going into people's homes in the wintertime to keep them from freezing. But thank you. The NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost, and Canadians can see it. Canadians are struggling to make ends meet with the inflation compounded by this Prime Minister's policies. We have put forward a common-sense Conservative motion to take the carbon tax off so that all Canadians can keep the heat on. Residents of Calgary Skyview want to know if they will be left out in the cold by their Liberal member. Will the government allow the backbenchers to vote for tax fairness for all Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, pricing carbon is a market-based solution. I know the member from Calgary Centre is an economist. He's a smart guy. We've spent some time in this House debating issues like this. But a market-based instrument is not a controversial one. We're talking about the most expensive, the dirtiest, the most intensive emissions way to heat a home, and getting Canadians off of that product and using an efficient heat pump to heat their home, to lower our emissions, and to make sure that we're driving toward a net zero future for Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Madam Speaker, small businesses need a real extension to repay the CEBA loans that they used to survive the pandemic. The Liberal solution, an 18-day extension. That's a cruel insult to businesses in my riding who are facing a perfect storm of post-pandemic recovery, high inflation, and now impacts from wildfires. The Penticton Chamber of Commerce is calling for action. So will the minister listen and give small businesses the 1-year extension to the CEBA loan deadline that they need to survive?
L'Honorable Ministre de la Petite Entreprise.
The Honourable Minister of Small Business.
I thank the Honourable member for that question. That is why we are offering additional flexibilities for small businesses to repay their CEBA loans. This includes a full 1-year extension on the term loan repayment deadline, more flexibility on refinancing, and more time to access that loan forgiveness, which is both balanced and fiscally responsible. We know times are tough, which is why our government is also cutting taxes for growing small businesses and lowering their credit card fees by up to a quarter. We will continue to listen to small businesses, Madam Speaker, and we will be there for all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
The long and painful legacy of Canada's neglect of Métis people has and continues to have horrific impacts on Métis children. Métis families in British Columbia deserve a child welfare system that centers them, their culture, and their future. Today, it fails to do just that. Métis children deserve to know that when their families need support, they will get that support by those who understand them most, their families. When will the government meet honorably with the Métis Nation of British Columbia to ensure Métis children in their province don't continue to fall through the cracks?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
I think the member opposite for his question and for his passion in regards to advancing Métis interests across Canada. You know, our government is committed to working with the Métis. Our government is continuing to advocate and make sure that all children, all Indigenous children in Canada have the proper supports. We're going to continue to work with First Nations. We're going to continue to work with Inuit. We're going to continue to work with Métis. We'll get it right. We're going to have to meet with the stakeholders to make sure we do so, but we're committed to doing so.
The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Madame la Présidente, members of the Natural Resources Committee have had their work brought to a standstill by a reckless and wasteful Conservative filibuster. They are deliberately trying to stop workers from getting a seat at the table and trying to end Atlantic Canada's offshore renewable energy opportunities by opposing vital legislation. Can the Parliamentary Secretary please share with this House the negative impact that delaying these important bills, C-49 and C-50, has on the lives of Canadian workers? Thank you.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Vaughan Woodbridge for the question. It is appalling that the Conservative Party would rather play political games, partisan games, derail the work of Parliament than actually roll up their sleeves and work. The Sustainable Jobs Act and the Atlantic Accord Act are vital pieces of legislation for economic development. We call on the Conservatives to listen to workers, to listen to labor leaders, to listen to Canadians who are asking them to get back to work and end this shameless, reckless filibuster.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Madam Speaker, the member from Calgary Skyview should be fighting to get the same tax relief for home heating for Calgarians that his party divisively gave to other parts of the country. His constituents, which are next door to mine, are struggling to buy food and afford mortgage payments after 8 years of this Liberal government. On Monday, he has a choice to make. Will he check the mail, stand up for the people of Calgary, and vote in favour of our common-sense Conservative motion to axe the tax on all forms of home heating?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Targeting home oil eating across the country. 1.3 million households have home eating oil. Oil heat is more expensive, 2 to 4 times more expensive than natural gas. Oil heating has nearly increased by 75% since 2022 with the war in Ukraine. We've also, Madam Speaker, increased the rural rebate. We've doubled it from 10 to 20%. These are affordable measures. I would encourage the Conservative Party to support climate change, to support affordability measures, to help the constituents, and support this program all across Canada.
A member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, I don't think a member from Edmonton Centre got that particular memo, because earlier this week, the member from Edmonton Centre, whose constituents overwhelmingly use natural gas to heat their homes, suggested his constituents, in fact all Canadians, should switch out their cleaner gas furnaces for expensive, dirty heating oil systems. Wow! I have a better idea. Will the member from Edmonton Centre get with the climate plan and vote in favour of our common sense motion to axe the tax on all forms of home heating and provide the same tax relief that his party is giving to other parts of Canada?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, we know the price of home heating oil has skyrocketed due to the global commodity prices, and that's why we're stepping up to help with a national program. The Conservative Party needs to do their homework. We are focused on ensuring we're addressing the pressing needs of every part of the country. I would encourage the member on the opposite of the Conservative Party to talk to their provincial premiers. We have Nova Scotia, we have PEI, we have Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. We need other premiers to come to the plate to establish a home pump program, make it free for all Canadians all across.
The honourable member for Langley-Aldergrove.
People in British Columbia are coming to realize that the NDP Liberal carbon tax is exactly that, a tax plan that is causing inflation, higher interest rates, higher mortgage payments. And after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government mismanaging our economy, Canadians are starting to realize that the Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. So on Monday, will he allow his members to vote yes to the common sense Conservative plan to take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the member opposite knows that BC has its own system, that's just not accurate. And it's not the only place we're seeing inaccuracies. Look at Health Committee and the accusations of waste there that are completely unfounded. They're talking about an advance purchase agreement for vaccines. Details relating to this contract released to the Standing Committee of Public Accounts in the context of their study of the Auditor General's report on COVID-19 vaccines was already there. All parties were able to review these documents with the appropriate confidentiality provisions in place. Due to a confidentiality agreement with the contractor, specific details of the contract, including the vendor name and financial information, could not be discussed publicly, and of course they know that.
Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Well, clearly the member opposite isn't even listening to what British Columbians are saying. 72% of people in my province say that the carbon tax is both ineffective and unfair, and even the NDP Premier is now calling for carbon tax fairness. Now, the member for Cloverdale-Langley City has a choice to make on Monday. Will he vote for the Liberal plan of different taxation for different people depending where they live? Or will he vote yes for the common sense Conservative plan to take the tax off to keep the heat on for all Canadians, all members of Cloverdale-Langley City?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Madam Speaker, my honourable colleague knows that British Columbia, as a leader in climate change, has been working hard for decades now, almost decades now, on its own price on carbon. The plan that we have put forward, Madam Speaker, will benefit thousands and thousands of British Columbians who continue to use home heating oil. They will be able to take advantage of what we have put in place. And in addition, working with the Premier of British Columbia, who has already said he is going to work with us to ensure that those British Columbians that cannot have access to heat pumps will be...
I'm sorry, somehow the Honourable Member could... the light went off, the microphone went off, so I will allow him to finish up the end of his...
Madam Speaker, simply put, what we have put in place will help British Columbians, the thousands of British Columbians who continue to use home heating oil. It will help them move to heat pumps, and the Premier of British Columbia has announced that he will work with us, and that is how we continue the fight against climate change, working together, not by opposing every single measure as the Conservatives do.
Madam Speaker, the Public Health Agency lost $150 million of taxpayer money on a failed contract. Wondering how it's possible to lose so much money? So are we, because the government refuses to say what the contract is, with whom, for what service, why it didn't work, and above all, why it did not demand to be reimbursed, since it got nothing for our money. Madam Speaker, Quebecers have a right to know. Who walked away with $150 million of public money without providing any services, and why? The Honourable Minister for Health.
I
remember at the start of the pandemic, it was a very difficult time for the country and for our people. At that time, it was necessary to make sure that all options were available. That's why we created agreements with many businesses that offered various types of vaccines, because it was impossible to know at that time who would be able to produce the right results. At the time, it was important to try every option. And that's the issue we're dealing with here today. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Madam Speaker, the government can't just cop out like that. The Parliamentary Budget Officer said the government should be able to provide at least some details, if not the name of the company. He also said that the loss of a $150 million contract clearly deserves an explanation. Madam Speaker, he's right. Quebecers do deserve an explanation. It's impossible that the government can't provide more details. So what happened with those $150 million? The Minister for Health. Madam Speaker, all details were available, not only to the Auditor General, but all the parties. Even the Bloc Québécois had a chance to see all the information. The process was related to measures for COVID-19. The information was available. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was extremely important for every option to be available. It was a reasonable action, and that is why Canada had the best pandemic response in the world.
Member for Miramichi Grand Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, you know what I hear back home about the carbon tax? You work all week to buy food that costs too much, and it's the same for gas. New Brunswick wants the carbon tax gone, just like they want the Prime Minister gone, because he's not worth the cost. On this side of the House, we understand the pressure the Liberal carbon tax has put on everyone, and we will continue to fight to axe the tax. Do the Atlantic MPs support the Prime Minister with his plan to quadruple the carbon tax to 61 cents after the next election?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Madam Speaker, after a year where Canadians have experienced record hurricanes, destruction from natural disasters, wildfires, the Conservatives still can't say the words climate change. They can't acknowledge that climate change is impacting our economy, our livelihoods, and in many cases, our very lives, Madam Speaker. We need to step up and fight climate change, and it's time that we stop debating whether we fight climate change, but how we fight climate change. So I would urge the members opposite, particularly those from Atlantic Canada, whose livelihoods are impacted by climate change every single season.
The honourable for Miramichi Grand Lake.
Madam Speaker, more divide and conquering from the other side of the floor. Last week, the minister from Long Range Mountains said the punishing carbon tax exemption wasn't granted to Canadians across the country because they didn't vote Liberal. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister said if re-elected, the NDP Liberal government will quadruple the carbon tax on home heating, gas, and groceries to 61 cents a litre. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister direct the Finance Minister in her call today with provincial ministers to axe the carbon tax for good and for everyone?
Honourable member for the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Sorry.
Madam Speaker, our ambition is to move Canadians who currently use home heating oil, which is the most carbon intensive, the least healthy, and the most expensive way to heat a home, onto an efficient heat pump. And I know for a fact that there's a lot of constituents in New Brunswick who still use home heating oil, but the Premier of New Brunswick still hasn't signed on to our heat pump program. So I'm going to spend the next couple of weeks talking to Conservative provincial members to try to convince the Premier of Ontario to sign on so that my neighbours in Milton who use home heating oil can have access to a high-efficiency heat pump and get off of that expensive, dirty way to heat their home.
For South Shore St. Margaret's.
Yesterday, Nova Scotia NDP Liberals said removing the carbon tax from home heating will only save pennies. Every tank of home heating oil has at least $200 of carbon tax, apparently just pennies to Liberals. The Liberal carbon tax plan now is to increase home heating oil and carbon taxes to $2,400 a year after the election. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Liberal who supports the quadrupling of the carbon tax to 61 cents a litre after the next election please stand up?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the Conservatives are not giving all the information. There is a rebate providing to Canadians. There's also what we've done last week. We've doubled the rural top-off to 20%, which is important. If the member would care about jobs, he would have voted for C-49. If the member cared about jobs, they would tell his party to stop filibustering the Natural Resources Committee to pass legislation on C-49. They won't even have the legislation come to committee for debate, to bring the premiers, to bring witnesses to talk about it. It's shameful, it's reckless, and they're not there for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacoste. Madam Speaker, when Canadians needed support during the pandemic, community groups and charities mobilized to provide essential assistance. Today, many of them are struggling to generate revenue, manage rising costs, as well as demand for services. And they have difficulty attracting and retaining volunteers and staff. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development inform this House of measures taken to support these organizations? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. I thank my colleague for her question. Thanks to the Community Services Recovery Fund, nearly 5,500 organizations across the country received funding. In the member's riding of Châteauguay-Lacoste, that means that groups like the Centre de 55 et Plus de Châteauguay can better support seniors. It also means that organizations like Cultivons Châteauguay can continue to nurture their community. And the Centre Multifonctionnel Horizon can continue to serve people with disabilities. These are local groups making a real difference, and I thank her.
Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Madam Speaker, last Thursday, the Prime Minister announced a temporary pause on the carbon tax on home heating for some Canadians, but not all. It's cold in Calgary in the winter, and after 8 years, Calgarians are struggling to afford to heat their homes and know that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. On Monday, will the MP for Calgary Skyview be permitted to vote for our common-sense Conservative plan to take the tax off so Canadians can keep the heat on, or will his vote get lost in the mail?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the question from the member from Calgary Rocky Ridge, but I would like to reinforce the fact that this is a Canada-wide program, and it is about getting Canadians off of home heating oil, not in one region, but in all regions, Madam Speaker, because heating your home with home heating oil is expensive, it is dirty, it is unhealthy, and it is the most emissions-intensive way to heat your home, Madam Speaker. A home heating pump will provide relief economically and on the environmental side as we lower our emissions, phasing out coal and dirty fuels like home heating oil right across Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The owner of Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Madam Speaker, this government and this parliamentary secretary are simply dividing Canadians. This government continues to divide Canadians, and it gets even colder in Edmonton. And it's obvious that the Minister for Edmonton Centre has absolutely no pull with this government because for years he has failed to deliver and to represent Alberta in cabinet. So Monday is his big chance. Will the Minister for Edmonton Centre finally stand up for Alberta and vote for our common sense motion to take the tax off so his constituents in Edmonton can keep the heat on?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Speaker, let me go back to the earlier questions about Northern Ontario. I'm happy to say that for the first time, the former leader of the Conservative Party from Regina Capel came to Northern Ontario. He's there now. People in Northern Ontario have voted strongly for strong Liberals MPs in Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay. I'm really happy to see that now for the first time the Conservative Party is paying attention to Northern Ontario. They voted against the critical mineral program, which is $3 billion. They voted against FedNor. They voted against EV. They're voting against projects that are important to Northern Ontario. I welcome the debate in the House.
Montmagny, l'honorable député de Montmagny, Lisle, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup.
Madam Speaker, next Monday, members of this House will have a choice. Vote for common sense and cancel carbon tax on all forms of home heating. After 8 years, this government still doesn't understand that it needs to give all Canadians a break. Unfortunately, the Bloc doesn't get it either. They want to radically increase the carbon tax. Voting for the Bloc is expensive. Will the Prime Minister finally listen to reason, ignore his Bloc friends, and vote for our motion?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. C'est important.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Unfortunately, I have to say this one more time, that there's no federal carbon tax in Quebec. The members for Quebec are fighting climate change. We are helping families and finding solutions that work for everyone. We are making solutions more affordable for all Canadians.
Madam Speaker, Canadians have always believed immigration is not only good for our economy, but also it's essential for the future of our communities. There's no doubt newcomers have been the engine of growth in Scarborough. They start new businesses, take care of our families, and also contribute significant skills to the fabric of our society. Mr. Speaker, could the Parliamentary Secretary for Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship please share our plan to bring newcomers to Canada and our vision on immigration in the years to come?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague from Scarborough Centre for her question. I was pleased to stand with Minister of Immigration as he tabled Canada's immigration levels plan this week. I'm delighted to share that Canada will continue to welcome skilled workers reunite loved ones, and stay true to a humanitarian tradition. We also have a sensible immigration plan that allows for stable growth to balance pressure on housing, infrastructure, and essential service. Immigration is important to Canada. We will continue to embrace newcomers and set them up for success. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable for Churchill, Kiwana-Newcastle.
Madam Speaker, York Factory First Nation has called a state of emergency, calling for federal help to get essential goods to their community. In the face of climate change, York Factory is clear. It needs all-weather road access. They cannot rely on ice roads. They are not alone. Other First Nations like Wasagamak and communities on the east side need all-weather road access now. From getting health care to bringing in building materials to lowering the cost of living, an all-weather road is about survival. Will the federal government work with York Factory, Wasagamak, and the East Side First Nations to build all-weather road access now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we realize that climate change is impacting Indigenous communities in the North far greater than they are doing in much of other parts of Canada. The Minister of Northern Affairs was with myself at the United Nations when we heard this. We are looking for solutions. We are looking to work with stakeholders. I look forward to talking with the member opposite to figuring out how our government can provide more supports, but we know climate change is real. We know it's impacting the North and coastal communities more than other communities, and we'll continue to fight climate change every step of the way.
Good job.
The honourable for Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, every 10 minutes, another child is killed in Gaza. UNICEF is now referring to Gaza as a graveyard for thousands of kids and a living hell for everyone else. In just the past week, a refugee camp has been bombed, more hospitals are no longer functioning, and over 900 Palestinian children have been killed in Gaza alone, in addition to 33 children killed in the West Bank and 29 in Israel. And so I ask again, how many children need to die until this government's going to call for a ceasefire?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his empathy and for his advocacy. We unequivocally condemn the Hamas terrorist attack. The price of justice cannot be the continued suffering of all Palestinian civilians. What is unfolding in Gaza is a human tragedy. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has been to the region twice to oversee our efforts to help Canadians and also work to de-escalate. We continue to call for humanitarian law to be upheld and for humanitarian pauses. Canadians must be allowed to leave. More humanitarian aid needs to be delivered, and all hostages must be released. Canada is committed to a goal of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Et c'est ce qui conclut
And that concludes question period.